Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Marguerite Winter, the Manager of Public Programs and Partnerships for the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and I'm pleased to welcome you to CAB's InDialogue series presented by Hindman Auctions. The current edition of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, The Available City, continues to be on view through December 18th citywide in Chicago. This evening's program, The Data at the Crossroads, organized by Southern California Institute of Architecture, panelists reflect on algorithmic decision-making in design and planning and how human experiences translate into data. This evening's event includes researchers from the Southern California Institute of Architecture, the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul University, and the Bartlett School of Architecture. Please note that this evening's program is being recorded and will be available for you to revisit on our YouTube channels. And we invite you to use the Q&A function for any questions that you may have for our panelists this evening. I will now hand it over to our moderator, critic, editor, and curator, Mimi Zeiger. Enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marguerite. And thanks all the attendees and our amazing panelists for joining us tonight for Data at the Crossroads. So I'm Mimi Zeiger. I'm based in Los Angeles and I'm visiting faculty at SCI-Arc. And I'm excited to convene this conversation within the context of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and especially under David Brown's theme, The Available City. Tonight, we're joined by a few panelists. Let me introduce them quickly. Riem is a designer and algorithmic consultant based in Los Angeles, and his architectural interactive media work has been widely exhibited. He's part of the Urban Past and Futures Lab at SCI-Arc, where he's faculty, and program manager of the Platforms and Automation Lab and MS Architectural Technologies coordinator. We're also joined by Masha Hupalo, senior research associate at SCI-Arc and also a member of the Urban Past and Futures Lab. She coordinates research projects and teaches design studios and seminars at SCI-Arc and is interested in the ways policy and big data inform planning and design, also the legal construct of territories and borders, and new forms of urbanization, kind of like the stuff we'll be talking about tonight. Jeff Smith is joining us from Chicago, and he is the executive director of the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul University. He produces research on the dynamics of neighborhood housing markets, including policy analysis and data that inform the local and national policy debates around neighborhood stability and the preservation and production of affordable rental housing. And finally, we have Ivo Tedbury, a designer and technology entrepreneur based in London. He is also a systems designer at AUR, AUAR, which are makers of robotically assembled homes, and is part of the automated architecture labs at the Bartlett School of Architecture. So welcome, everybody. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen and give a brief overview of some of the initial framing for AI and the future of housing, a course taught at SCI-Arc by Casey and myself over 2 semesters in 2020 and 2021. And the research in 2021 was supported in part by a Google AMI award. And after that, I'll turn it over to our 4 panelists, each for a short presentation, and then we can come together for a dialogue and sort of start to suss out the places where we have overlaps, or even maybe even more excitingly kind of conflicts between different approaches. So let me just share the screen quickly. So data at the crossroads. The pairing of 2 complex topics like housing and AI is really not intended to bolster neoliberal approaches to, say, disrupting existing practices of the kind that we see in ventures such as Zillow or Uber or Airbnb and others. Instead, this research that Casey and I embarked upon with students in AI and the Future of Housing is interested in exploring the ways that machine learning and neural networks tools might offer greater accessibility to individuals and communities often left out of these discussions, while being aware of the implicit biases that come with both systems of housing and systems of artificial intelligence. And so here is our beginning of the class, and this class looks at this important intersection, really, of machine learning, housing policy design, and development through a few questions, which situates them within Los Angeles, a place which is certainly in the throes of a housing crisis and has increasing numbers of unhoused people. So we sort of said they kind of began the class thinking about what is the future of housing in Los Angeles, right? A really big, bold statement. And then thinking about whether that future will be equitable, whether or not it'll be affordable or even sustainable. And historically, of course, we have here Los Angeles's red line map. Urban planning and real estate development have been the site of disenfranchisement, exclusion, and segregation here in Los Angeles. Andrea Gibbon, who is the author of The City of Segregation, counters ideas coming from Rainer Banham of a kind of free-flowing ecology for Los Angeles by writing, LA is orchestrated to ensure movement from enclave to privileged enclave for a few, enabling ignorance of the poverty and structural violence experienced by millions walled into place. Preservation of this ignorance is foundational to white supremacism and other privileges of gender and class. So moving from that, thinking about how does that get sort of manifested? So this is a photo by Leonard Nadel, who photographed changing housing conditions in Los Angeles for the California Housing Authority throughout the 1950s and 60s. The so-called slum clearing of Latinx families from Chavez Ravine in advance of the construction of Dodger Stadium is perhaps the most poignant example of forced displacement in the name of development. But such violence continues. In the spring of 2020, homeless families squatted in empty homes owned by Caltrans, and by Christmas, they were forcefully evicted. And equitable housing is an ever-increasing critical issue in Los Angeles, where pre-pandemic market rates were leading to increased rates of unhoused residents, and present conditions under COVID only amplify renter precarity and eviction rates, which is felt intensely in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, groups that have been hit the hardest by the coronavirus and historic injustices. So how might increasing ubiquitous technologies like neural networks recognize the impacts of gentrification, economic imbalances, and historic injustices such as redlining? AI and the Future of Housing, this course also was critically considering the fundamental tools and approaches that undergird housing in a densifying city like LA. And it looked critically at policy like State Bill 50 that sort of allowed for ADU development and sort of anticipated things like State Bill 9, which is sort of taking on single-family zoning and allowing for denser lots. But also thinking about the changing cultures of housing. And here I'm showing the Hype House McMansion, which is home to TikTok superstars. But as we say this, we're also wary of any savior narratives of big tech and the conscious, and also conscious of the ethics of data and data collecting. So In the 2017 piece, 10 Simple Rules for Responsible Data Research, the collective authors write, and I have the quote here, harm can also result when seemingly innocuous data sets about population-wide effects are used to shape the lives of individuals or stigmatize groups, often without procedural recourse. And to this, I think I like to quote Casey, who's going to present right after me. But Casey has a background in statistics, and he uses the term constructed probabilities to underscore the fact that machine learning is indeed a construct. It's not neutral, it's not magical. It ultimately reflects the subjectivities that are built into data sets. And even with that, though, one of the strengths of AI is the ability to sort large amounts of information and create correlations between different sets of data. So I think I'll sort of leave it that kind of hanging there for Casey to pick up on and the rest of our panelists. So I will turn the floor over to Casey so he can share some of his thoughts on the work that we produced in our course.
Okay, let me go ahead and get this open. Thank you, Mimi. All right, can you guys see that okay? Great. So I'm going to just kind of speak specifically about some of the things that we're pursuing for this year's version of the project and the deliverables we're putting together for the Google AMI project. As Mimi has said, we've been teaching together for the last few years, looking at different implementations for machine learning and AI-based platforms and softwares relative to the housing issues in Los Angeles. In previous years, we looked a lot more at like kind of automating design processes, looking at inefficiencies in site locations and site zonings for kind of producing automated pavilions. But for this semester, we wanted to take a much more kind of specific course where we weren't asking the students to essentially do a design studio within a seminar course at the same time. So this course this year and like what we're working on for the project is specifically looking at different ways of understanding the problems around housing in LA. And the end of this is we're producing an interactive app as a way of communicating some of the possibilities around development and different forms of development within Los Angeles using these types of machine learning neural networks. So the seminar course, in a lot of ways, was a chance to work with the students to both kind of look at existing policy issues, look at kind of the existing open source data that we can collect that's publicly available from the city, and also start to look at like what sorts of holes there are, what sorts of possibilities there are for us to use these kind of correlating methods, as Mimi said, to put together arguments for new forms of housing development, which there may be some resistance to in Los Angeles. Interestingly, I think from a year and a half ago when we put the proposal together for putting this app out, I think that the app's big focus in terms of its design was going to be as a tool for lobbying, at least partially, to try to reduce the single residence zoning or find like alternatives to it. And in the interim, that's no longer an issue, or it seems like it's been passed out of existence. So we'll see how that develops. But now I think we're beginning to pivot a lot of the things that we're looking at in this past couple months towards more as a kind of tool for communicating the possibilities to a public that may be resistant to development or densification in their neighborhoods, and trying to use these tools to communicate kind of benefits or simulate possible versions of a neighborhood that could come into existence by adopting this type of development. Within the seminar, we kind of looked at tools in two different ways. One set was for kind of correlating and analyzing non-standard data to develop kind of new perspectives around the housing development in LA. And then on the other side, we're using more generative networks to simulate potential transformations to the LA residential neighborhood in order to quantify the impacts of policy or design decisions. So an example of the former, we're very influenced by the work by Sarah Williams, who also generously came by the seminar to talk about her work. and using social media platforms in China as an example to identify like ghost developments, our students began to look at like alternative sources of representational information about neighborhoods and try to begin to correlate those towards existing housing development and where, you know, what other kind of factors may begin to be tied to why some neighborhoods were more likely to engage in development versus others, outside of things which are kind of available about kind of average property values and so forth. So there was a lot of throwing pasta at the wall. For example, this group was trying to see if there was a correlation between rental values, development, and Yelp reviews of local grocery stores. So they kind of scraped massive data sets based on zip codes of different food options within a region to see, and then ran that through a series of sentiment analysis to see if there was some kind of correlation between the types of amenities in the neighborhood and the developments that happened there. Kind of interestingly, I mean, all of these are very undercooked or half-cooked studies within the project. We're more kind of looking for things that might be interesting to pursue as we go. But it kind of hilariously, in this case, we found out that people paying $6,000 a month in rent are equally angry about their grocery stores as people paying closer to $1,000 of rent. So there probably is no kind of relationship between those depictions of a neighborhood. On the other side of that, we have projects like this one, which were using semantic or image segmentation to identify combined with GIS to identify within lots like the existing building construction, and using neural networks to locate potential footprints for additional construction within those sites based on some of the ADU guidelines and setbacks, and then taking those new masks and looking at kind of rendering out a transformed version of the city. And this sort of thing, actually, we think is starting to work pretty well. We used similar techniques in the past semesters to look at kind of automating the construction design. And this is something that we're kind of persisting with through into the final app. So we'll get to that at the end. But we also let the group kind of run wild, where they began to look at using the network to simulate what would happen to a neighborhood if different locales zoning codes were adopted for this region. So the image on the left is from, I believe, Highland Park here in Los Angeles, and it's predominantly single resident or SRO, or single family residence, not SRO, sorry. That's something completely different. Single family residence, where the thing on the right is a kind of extrapolation from Houston's zoning code, which is effectively a no zoning code, where there's an intense kind of mix. So this group kind of ran through a bunch of options where they were looking at kind of radical transformations of the Los Angeles kind of plains of id, as Rainer Banham called them, the kind of uninterrupted suburban sprawl, when transformed towards the density of something like, in this case of Houston. I think they also did like looked at urban Mumbai, some Asian cities in terms of which were much higher density, and began to produce these kind of speculative maps of what a neighborhood could be under different kind of zoning codes. Some of the groups had a lot of synchronicity in terms of what they're looking at. So this group worked with the Google Sunroof project application to train a model to predict available solar area, because they wanted to make a case for for how increasing the kind of built roof area within a neighborhood could also increase the amount of solar production for that neighborhood. So this is an example of a kind of before and after, top and bottom. So basically kind of not piggybacking on, but working in tandem with the previous group who was looking at kind of adding additional construction to this site. And this group was looking at like how they could begin to predict what kind of benefits there might be for the electrical grid or for revenue sources for solar production before and after a kind of max implementation of ADU construction within a neighborhood. So I think actually is fairly marginal in terms of the benefits, but on aggregate, it's pretty large. I think within an individual house by house basis, it's not necessarily significant, but when you start to look at the neighborhood or community, you start to get bigger payoffs with that. So as we're developing the app, there's a series of layers that we're currently integrating into it and kind of retraining these networks. Some of them are building off of the networks developed in a class where we're going back through more rigorously and developing the data sets, including the maximizing the ADU footprint, the satellite image transformations that we talked about. But as we've begun to move away from a kind of tool for lobbying and more of a tool for marketing, one of the things that came up in our discussions about the project, both with Henrik and Eva from Google AMI and the rest of our guests for the course, as this thing becomes more of a marketing tool, we wanted to start to look at like simulating perspectival effects of this addition to the neighborhood as a way of again beginning to kind of negotiate NIMBYism and bring a kind of comfort level or positive thinking about this added density and added housing to the neighborhood. So we're working on that right now, which is kind of the only one that wasn't at least somehow tangentially involved in a network that we've trained in the past. But we also have these additional layers on here, like with the estimated rental value, which we developed from an older project in my office, and the solar one. So the perspectival one is not going great. We've been looking at kind of mining examples of like Google Street Views for single family residentially zoned neighborhoods and multi-family zoned neighborhoods. We've been working through a few different techniques to explore the transformation. At this point, it just tends to like kind of stretch the roof a little bit and add some windows, which is not ideal. So this is very much still a work in progress. But our goal is that as part of the app, there will be a kind of real-time Google Street View network, which you can overlay a portion of the image and do this transformation between kind of imagining what the neighborhood will look like before and after the added development, which is going to accumulate in a kind of interactive app where you'll be able to click on a satellite view of your neighborhood, pull up the ADU drawn in with the network, with the rental approximations, and start to get a kind of Google Street View transformation of the front of your house with a multi-family rezoned kind of architecture behind it. And that's kind of where we are at the project right now. We're going to be working on this app through, I believe we're going to launch it by the end of January, but maybe sooner. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to make this quick. I've got a barking dog, but I'll pass it over to Masha for her to share her research.
Thank you, Mimi. Let me share. Can you see my screen? Right, okay. Great. I'm also going to share some work in progress. And this is one of the projects that I'm working with together with Case Miller and a group of students, where we are exploring the longer term impacts of the pandemic on displacement in our region. And our goal is to essentially close the knowledge gap that is essential for making informed decisions in low-income housing policies. And by using unconventional metrics, some of them that Casey described, we're trying to create a comprehensive picture of the localized displacement pressures and eviction hotspots in Los Angeles County, but at the same time develop this as a methodology that can be applied in other cities or by other organizations or even individuals. So as you all probably know, there were different types of support for the last 2 years for the low-income renters, from rent relief to mortgage deferrals to stimulus checks and eviction moratoriums. But right now in LA, we still have 2 moratoriums in place, the level of city and the level of county. But we also know that the moratoriums did not stop from people getting evicted. And here's the diagram of the eviction process, and you can see that it's a very complex process for tenants to navigate when they're already in distress, whether it's a financial distress or it's a health one or a mental one. And that's usually the case, that they don't really have a legal representation. And sometimes this leads to even self-eviction. And that is becoming increasingly the problem. And we have had a lot of conversations with defense attorneys and with tenant unions, and they've all been concerned about this happening, but the information that they have and the data that they have is really on the level of individual stories that they don't have time or the means to turn into an actionable data that can be used for future advocacy. So coming back to evictions, we know that eviction records are kept for 7 years at courts, but we again found out that we cannot really access them. They're not really publicly accessible. They're accessible to tenants' community organizations, but not really to research institutions or individuals. At the same time, we know there, by estimates, that there are around 3 million people getting evicted every year in the country. And because of the COVID, it's probably going to rise almost 10, 12-fold by some predictions. But the problem is, like, we don't really know who is getting evicted, from where, and how to focus the aid and outreach to these people. And so in this, once we faced that wall, a couple of months into our research, we started thinking, like, what are the other metrics? How can we measure the neighborhood change? How can we look into, how can we describe what is happening also on the level of individual, not only from the level of US Census Bureau of Statistics. So we decided to look into different platforms and companies and think about how we can use this public data and for our means. And we would try, I think we're both very interested in how this methodology can reveal this complex relationship between digital platforms, the data that we collectively contribute to it as users, and the neighborhood change that is happening on the ground. So we started looking into Twitter and Reddit and Zillow and Redfin and everything that we can get our hands on that can provide us a bigger picture of what is happening on the ground. And but first of all, we decided to look at the very basic census tract ACSS data to just understand where should we look because of the time constraints. And so we tried to find the most vulnerable census tracts based on different metrics, like level of cost burden population, so the population that pays more than half of their income on rent, then the level of population that live below poverty line, and the level of unemployment in census tracts. And I have to say that we looked only at places where we have more than 500 renter households. That was our focus because we didn't want to have single family zones where people own their homes. So that's a whole other type of displacement we'll be talking about there. So we got to this map where we figured out the places we should be looking at further, our focus areas, and we got to 6 focus neighborhoods. And we decided slightly unconventionally first not to look into the demographics data of how old our people are, or what is their income, what is their level of education. We decided to look at the social media and see, like, what are people saying online about their neighborhoods. And we trained a very simple neural network to get messages and posts from Reddit where people describe their intentions of buying the house in the neighborhoods that we've been looking into. And, like, as you can see from the slide, very often people post how old they are, what is their income, how much do they have in their down payment, and what do they want to do with that property, and asking for advice whether it's a good investment. And we wanted this kind of stories. They also wanted stories of eviction processes and unlawful evictions. We got them as well. But to be honest, the amount of the stories that we've collected is not really actionable yet. So we cannot really use it as a tool for advocacy. We cannot pass it further down to the organizations at their work. And we're trying to figure out what are the other ways of collecting it. Maybe using different platforms, maybe using different algorithms, different networks. But this is really much in progress. And parallel to that, we also decided to look at the rental listings and sale listings on places like Zillow and Redfin. And we got to that point where we saw what has been posted, and then we looked into where those places were, how they were zoned, what kind of properties they were, when were they built, how close they are to transit, whether there was some underutilized zoning available, and whether there were several units sold within one apartment building, just whatever we could get our hands on, to be honest. And then we started comparing our results, and one of this was very interesting, where you could see it's a snapshot of all the properties that were listed for sale in the 6 areas, and where you can see that it's disproportionately more in South LA of single family homes that were built between 1920 and 1950. That was, and of course, it's a snapshot. We got 160 properties, but it still got us somewhere further. And then the next step was that we decided to think okay, so it was 1.5 years between the March 2020 and the first lockdown and July 2021 when we got our snapshots. So we thought well, let's just see where we can find how many homes have been sold twice within this 1.5 years. And 16% of what we looked at were sold twice. And you can see here the difference between the price that they were bought, they were sold the first time, and the price the second time, how many days they were off the market. But most importantly, I wanted to show you this outlier, and this is the line here, where the home was bought for sold for $440,000. The single family home built in 1920s, it was torn down, and in 424 days it was rebuilt as a fourplex that is not rent controlled, that is market rate. And because apartments built after 1991, I think, in Los Angeles, they're not rent controlled. So it's not, we can't make any conclusions from this, but this is one of those things that we found alarming while going through our data. And the others are really weirdly described. You see here, a lot of the times they're called great opportunity for passive income, or someone underscores that there's an opportunity to add units to maximize the value of this asset. So the language around this housing is very disturbing. And one of the things that we're trying to figure out at the moment is how we can maybe have a neural network that would recognize this type of listings, and we could see where they are occurring more and more in which neighborhoods. And finally, we're right now in this moment where we're trying to automate that process that I described to you. And this is a very boring dry diagram. How we're trying to make this, how we're trying to explain this to a software developer and a coder, how we want it to be automated so that we don't have to go through this weekly process of evaluating and comparing our data, so that we can deploy it further throughout the whole city, and we can give it back to the organizations that we've been in conversation with in the beginning, and see what other types of information we could add based on their experience that would be helpful for them to bring further to politicians and policymakers. And that's all I wanted to share today. Thank you.
Thank you, Masha. And let's kick it over to Jeff.
Good evening, everybody. Let me just get my screen shared here real quick. Hello, my name is Jeff Smith. I am the Executive Director of the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul University. And what I'll be talking about here is some of the work that we've done over the last 5 or so years to just kind of wrap our minds around the issue of displacement and build some leading indicators that are intended to help practitioners be proactive in understanding the impact that trying to understand the impact that a catalytic type investment might have on housing affordability in adjacent communities. So just really quickly, IHS is an applied research center. We're based in the business school at DePaul. When I say applied research, our audience is practitioners. So we're really trying to create information, be it reports, data visualizations, or provide technical assistance to folks who are trying to make different types of decisions on housing community development policies. So to do that, we collect a lot of different kinds of data from multiple sources. A lot of the data is from local administrative agencies. So data on the from the Cook County assessor, for example, who collects information to assess property values and has lots of information on the characteristics of every parcel in the county. Data feeds on property sales, so deed transfers, lien, mortgage recordings, foreclosure activity, eviction. So all of these different data, all these different administrative processes generate data, and we've been fortunate enough to get a feed that we then take that data and improve it and build different types of indicators to help inform different types of policies. So we collect the data, do some work with that to improve that data, and then a big part of that work is really engaging with practitioners to help them connect that information to their decisions. And really that's kind of how we got into this topic. Is there was a big catalytic, exciting for many project on the northwest side of the city called the 606. It was one of these types of projects where you're converting an old abandoned rail line into a fancy, beautiful park system. It was 3 miles on the northwest side of the city, as a signature project for the Biennial administration. And early in his first term, it was announced, and a lot of stakeholders in the neighborhood were excited. It was checking a lot of boxes related to adding green space, connecting different kinds of communities that were maybe otherwise disconnected from one another. But in the planning process, there really wasn't an active discussion on the impact that this type of catalytic investment might have on housing affordability in the neighborhood. And as the project came closer to fruition and completion, a lot of groups who were active in the neighborhood, were concerned about some of the warning signs that they were seeing in their communities around, brokers kind of knocking on doors and trying to get long-term owners to sell their properties at discounted prices, just rising rents, the rising cost of real estate in the neighborhood, particularly along the western end. So they approached us. We've had relationships with these folks, and we're fortunate enough to get a little bit of a grant at that time to do some work to understand what was the actual impact that this investment was having on housing prices in the city. And so just for those who are in Chicago, this map might look familiar. For those elsewhere, maybe not. But the 606 is a 2.7 mile linear trail, and we sort of looked at an area essentially about a mile buffer around that trail. And what was clear as we started to dig into the data was that really there were the trail, the neighborhood conditions, the demographic characteristics, the housing market characteristics really changed as you went from east to west. On the east side of the trail was a much higher income, higher value, higher home ownership area, Bucktown, Wicker Park. As you went further west, you started to get into more low and moderate income, much more renter oriented, different type of housing stock, much more Hispanic, and lower income larger family households. So you saw really different sort of market context, different demographic conditions. And that really sort of set the stage, I think, for the displacement pressures that this catalytic investment had on the surrounding community. So we've spent a lot of time trying to crunch the numbers around property sales and understanding how to extract sort of information from sales data. This is a trend line that shows indexed to 2000 how prices change. So by the way, a lot of the data in this first part of the presentation is going to look at 606 East and 606 West. We kind of drew a line there to sort of characterize these two different parts of the 606 area. So this dark line is what is the 606 East, 606 West trend line. The lighter line is 606 East. What you see here is how prices change from 2000 going to, and this report was current through 2016, I believe, early 2016. And then you have here kind of pegged along these different lines, different key points in time along the 606 development timeline, when the project was announced, when ground broke, and when the project actually opened. And what you see is, during that long-term time period, you see the housing bubble, you see the crash, and you see the recovery period. You see in the 606 East, a much more, like I mentioned, a much more stable housing market, wasn't as impacted by the ups and downs of the housing, the broader housing market at that time. The 606 West did see a big jump in house prices, a drop in values during sort of the Great Recession period, and then a much more sharp increase in values and the recovery in values from the bottom of the market. So there's a lot of stuff going on, right? So you can look at that and you can see, well, hey, that's sort of, the 606 was announced, prices in the 606 West went up dramatically. That's obviously a big problem, but clearly there's lots of stuff happening in the market that might also lead to those, sharp price increases beyond just this particular project. So we did some additional spatial analysis looking at sort of the impact that proximity to the trail had on sale price. And so that's what this map shows. And it shows that in the East, we couldn't really find any statistical significance in terms of house prices and proximity to the trail. Prices were already very high, and the trail was an amenity in an already amenity-rich area, so it didn't really move the needle by itself in that segment of the 606 area. But if you go to the West, where prices were much lower and more affordable, you see that buyers, probably not local community residents, but probably outside investors, were bidding and competing and paying a premium to purchase real estate closer to the 606. So we were able to say that about out to half a mile, buyers were paying a premium to purchase properties above what they would have purchased for a similar property in a different place that wasn't near the 606. So that premium at the closest band was about 22% over a similar property in a different part of the city. What that translates to, if you look at the 606 East versus West, is about $100,000 on the standard sale price of a property in the 606 West. So 606 East, again, very expensive, much more expensive than the 606 West area, but that premium did add quite a bit of value to the typical sales price back in 2015. So this was really interesting, exciting, but at the end of the day, all that had already happened. And so it was interesting from an academic perspective, but not as useful for the folks on the ground who are trying to get ahead of this type of market pressure. And so what we did was sort of sat down and looked at some of the inputs that we thought could have been predictive of this type of market shift and displacement pressure in the event of a future catalytic investment. And so we created a number of maps. One map looked at vulnerability, where we kind of did a clustering analysis of different economic, demographic, housing stock data, and associated essentially 6 different clusters in the city. We thought that 3 of those clusters were vulnerable to displacement. So that means they had a lot of lower income households, a lot of renter households, a lot of cost burden households. The differences between those 3 clusters largely lay in the nature of the housing stock. Some areas had higher levels of subsidy, some areas had more 2 to 4 unit buildings. So it was more of a variation in the housing stock than it was in some of the otherwise demographic and economic vulnerability of the population. So we identified 3 clusters that were vulnerable to displacement. And then we looked at the market and looked at areas, mapped out property sales, and tried to see areas that were high cost, moderate cost, and low cost effectively, and then looked at how prices were changing. And the thought was, in areas where prices are increasing above the city average, those are rising markets, and that those price increases are indicators of some type of changing demand for housing. And if you look at those sub tiers of high cost, moderate cost, and low cost, that's an indicator of what the current housing values are. So if you look at the city, you see on this map, for example, areas that are selected here are those that we identified as having a high percentage of populations that would be vulnerable to displacement in a rising cost environment. And then the red are high cost areas with rising prices. So prices are rising above average. The green areas are sort of moderate cost areas. Those are areas where prices are about average for the city, but they're rising more rapidly than the city average. And the blue areas are lower cost areas. So prices are in the lower third of the city sort of spectrum, but prices are still rising above average. And so we created this typology and then created some, kind of market, characterizations of these from a displacement pressure perspective. So areas that are red, which is you sort of see the 606 area is the red, a bit of a red and a bit of green. The areas that are red are already probably experiencing significant displacement pressures because costs are high, prices are rising rapidly, and you've got a vulnerable population. So that mix of characteristics means displacement is likely happening, which may limit the number of potential interventions that are possible given just the cost of the market, the competitiveness of the market. So you may have a suite of policies like inclusionary zoning that might be more appropriate for that type of market context. Those green areas where prices are perhaps less expensive, but maybe those are sort of those tipping point type neighborhoods where a catalytic investment might, attract that outside investors, those speculators who are looking, maybe not speculators, but folks who are looking for, return on that investment based on that potential future, infrastructure project or CTA station or other types of expected amenity added to the neighborhood. Those types of areas, because of the cost, there may be a larger number of options, inclusionary zoning, because you don't have large developments happening in those areas. The market hasn't quite gotten there yet. That might not be an appropriate strategy, but some type of mission-oriented developer working with who's interested in sort of acquiring for sale and actually occurring affordable housing, for example, and keeping it affordable. Working with existing owners of properties who may want to continue to own the property, but just can't fix the roof or can't do some of the basic maintenance on an older housing stock, and those costs might cause them to sell a property. So if you make certain small incentives available or small grant programs available to those types of owners, that those owners might choose to own for a longer period of time. You might have opportunities for property tax incentives for owners to keep those properties affordable. By opting into certain types of land trust vehicles available at the city. So there's, again, a certain set of potential incentives out there that might be appropriate for that market context. And then those blue areas are really a different type of market. Those are some of the, kind of more disinvested parts of Chicago where, history of discrimination and disinvestment really means long-term population loss, a lot of vacant land, a lot of really distressed properties. The foreclosure crisis, again, amplified and really amplified and exacerbated some of those long-term disinvestment pressures. So the concerns about like gentrification and displacement due to rapidly rising costs are maybe a little different there. Those are areas where the displacement is more driven by that long-term disinvestment. But that doesn't mean that there aren't need for catalytic investments, that there isn't need for comprehensive long-term planning. And so in those markets, you may have lots of available vacant land, and if maybe city-owned land, maybe privately owned land, maybe low-cost real estate, but there may be an opportunity to accumulate those parcels in anticipation of that future catalytic investment to have more control over sort of the outcomes of the sort of the broader market and mitigate that long-term displacement pressure and create opportunities for affordability in those places that may not otherwise exist. If you have speculators who are very common actors in those lower cost neighborhoods because prices are really low, so folks can come in and just buy real estate and sit on it for many years without really needing to invest in it at all. So just kind of going back to the 606 and looking at sort of some follow-up analysis, this is what the trail looks like. We from this market typology of high cost, moderate cost, low cost, vulnerable, not vulnerable. We did see again that the 606 West was kind of divided into a vulnerable and not vulnerable, market typologies. If we look at sort of how house prices changed, we see, not surprisingly, that the 606 West vulnerable area saw really dramatic increases in prices compared to the other two parts of that 606 area. What does this mean in real actual price terms? Again, we saw prices go from $96,000 for a single family for 1 to 4 unit property, in 2012 to $430,000 in that vulnerable portion of the 606. Again, which is a rapid price increase, an indicator of market pressure. And this is just sort of going through some additional demographic data to highlight some of the changes that have been happening in the neighborhood. And you can see on that sort of far left column, it's a somewhat income diverse area, but majority of the folks in that area earn less than $50,000. And if you look at sort of how that's changed over time, you see that that's where you really are losing the most population, that 606 West. So this, is just an indicator of that displacement is actually occurring, and that there is sort of a change and a transformation in the market. Again, if you look at it from a more of a racial equity lens, you see that part of the 606 West is predominantly Hispanic. And again, if you look at sort of how populations are changing in that area, you see a big drop in the Hispanic population and a big increase in the white population, right? So you see that there's an economic and racial change happening in that area. Indicator, again, that this displacement is actually something that's happening. How is it happening? Again, it's sort of a product of a loss of low-cost rental housing. A lot of the work that we do is trying to understand, why, in the big picture of some of the work that we've done, we've seen that, and this is Chicago. I know some folks have been talking about Los Angeles. It's very different market context from a housing perspective. But in Chicago, the issue is less. There's a lot of low-income people, a lot of low-income renters that need affordable housing. There are, but that number is not necessarily growing. The housing crisis is really driven by the loss of affordable supply. And so, and this is sort of what that looks like. In a 8-year period, essentially, you see that the share of rental units that were considered "quote unquote" affordable in the 606 went from about a little bit over half of the housing rental units to 26%. So you had a big drop in those that are lower cost rental units in the area. And as we drill into some of the specific drivers of that loss, we've really, looked at a particular segment of the market, 2 to 4 unit buildings. There's a bigger kind of, which is an important component of what a lot of people call naturally occurring affordable housing. Some people really hate that term. It's essentially low cost, unsubsidized, affordable housing. That's where most people, when they find their first apartment, they usually live in one of those units, so that it's sort of familiar to them. But really, because there's no protection, no income restrictions on those units, landlords are able to raise rents as much as they want. If they decide to sell their properties, new owners will, raise their rents as much as they want, as much as they need to justify their sales price. So, so it's really from that segment of the market that you're losing the affordable rental supply, and this 2 to 4 unit building stock is sort of, in Chicago at least, is particularly under pressure, particularly in those high cost neighborhoods. And this is just a slide showing what the loss of that stock looks like. So from this, we developed an outward facing mapping tool that folks can go to and sort of look at their neighborhood and see what's happening. There are a few, we did this initially a few years ago. There were a number of catalytic investment projects. The 606 was one. The Obama Presidential Center was another that just broke ground recently down in the south side of the city near a Woodlawn neighborhood in Jackson Park. A lot of residents down there are concerned of how the Obama Center paired with the University of Chicago and access to transit and proximity to some nice parks and the lake, how this combination of factors will potentially affect affordability for long-term residents. And even though it's a South Side neighborhood that has a history of disinvestment, that this investment is not going to really benefit the local residents. So trying to develop some data tools to help both local stakeholders in the neighborhood, but also city planners kind of figure out what that might look like. So that's what we have done around this issue of displacement pressure. Some of the data here is a little bit older, but this is ongoing work that we continue to update, and it continues to be a very important topic for us.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much, Jeff. Let's turn it over to Ivo, and then we can sort of try to find some threads between this different material, which is starting to brew.
Is that coming through?
We can see your screen.
Great. Thanks very much for the invitation. So this is work that my colleague Molly Claypool was originally going to present. Unfortunately, she's been struck down by COVID, so it's taking some rest. So yeah, really looking forward to sharing some thoughts on automation and production of architecture. So in our work, we think about ways in which we can dismantle the power structures that have contributed to the status quo in built environment production. And really that these existing methods of production and the policies that frame and reproduce these methods are not geared to address the major global issues, such as the housing crisis, where we need 2 billion new homes over the next 80 years. And also that those existing methods of production are not geared at all towards the climate emergency. For example, if cement industry was a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter in the world. And like architecture and construction, planning is also generally not well situated to deliver on these needs in many places. So I'm speaking from the UK. We're a kind of UK-based organization, research lab. The planning practices are often heavily top-down and engage in processes that treat community consultation as though it's just an afterthought. At the same time, for decades, the dominant narrative around automation in construction has been around loss of jobs using manual labor. Often the digital fabrication technologies that are developed to replace these jobs focus purely on the productivity gained by implementing the use of, call it a single task robot. So a bricklaying robot, a tile laying robot, a welding robot, etc. And then other benefits such as improved worker health are just treated as a peripheral positive outcome. And not only are these robots extremely expensive, but they're also extremely limited. And while they're technical innovations in digital fabrication or digital construction, they're solving very narrow, very localized problems. At the same time, investment in construction automation has also occurred at the scale of the factory, taking a similar approach to car manufacturing. Modular housing factories result in the centralization of housing production to offsite factories and completely disconnected to the context in which these systems are actually deployed. And therefore, factory-made housing is seen as displacing local jobs, which creates resistance and skepticism amongst the local communities, and really creates limited localized capacity for housing produced using that automation. And the failure of this model is currently quite acute, with the construction unicorn Curator collapsing earlier this year. And it's a great example of how the automation gap in construction is not just a problem that can be solved with a single technology or a fully integrated production chain. It's not just a problem of efficiency or productivity. And we think that it's more a problem of design. And that design touches on, for example, frameworks of labor, interdependence, resilience, policies, decision-making and care. And yeah, asking then, what is architecture then? Or an architectural framework for production designed for automation? What we propose is that we radically redesign how architectural parts are designed in relationship to automation, both as a process, for example, in relationship to what technologies we use, and also framework for production, for example, in relationship to the context in which we're working, and how accessible is automation for the people who we're working with and we're serving with the design. And this has resulted in a proposition that a significant reduction in the number of architectural parts is possible, and enables us to rethink around the dichotomy that exists between design and building cultures. This approach is sort of known as the discrete, where architectural parts are not being constrained to types like column, floor slab, beam, or staircase. And instead we think of them more similar to the zeros and ones in code. The same building parts can be used to construct, for example, as in this image, every part of a building's core structure. And part of that discrete approach in the work is also embedding enough intelligence and simplicity in architectural parts to enable people to engage with and interact with them in very intuitive ways, both physically and digitally. So the part of the intelligence of the discrete block itself is to design ways of working that can empower communities to participate in designing and making, to take back power and to create the homes and spaces that they need. Getting a little bit more specific, block type A, which makes up our discrete housing system, is prefabricated post-tensioned timber system, which incorporates reversible connections that allow for reconfiguration and adaptation of the system over time. And this is based on the principles of digital materials, concept drawn from mechanical engineering, that behind it has principles of part variation and part reversibility, enabling a huge versatility of parts. And these versions of the blocks also use very simple tools and requires very little expertise and training to both prefabricate and assemble them into the final structure. And so in the spin-out company that's attached to the research lab, we're currently working on fully automating a new version of the block for both prefabrication and building assembly, and that hugely decreases the assembly time and the manual labor component. Moving away from the actual architectural part and towards a more inclusive and resilient framework for automation in that architectural production, we have seen automation for what it really is, largely centralized and extractive. And we're interested in notions of collectivity, where workers have ownership over both the methods and also the modes of production, as well as the physical things that they produce. And a key part of this is trying to design frameworks for automation that distributes expertise and keeps the value that is co-created by the communities that create, and keep it within those very communities that are producing. And in our case, also that includes prototypes for production, as well as the prototypes of actual homes and houses. And in both the lab and spin-out company, we've designed a mission lock or set of principles that guides our future plans, protecting the social purpose as we scale the work in terms of strategic partnership, but also with communities who will ultimately inhabit the buildings. Overall, we found that this makes the process of design and production much more accessible for people typically sort of discarded and othered by professional practice and industry, widening the boundaries of who can actually participate in the work. And a core question that we ask ourselves is, what is the capacity of an engaged scholarship or value-centered approach to enhancing citizen-led design using automation and use housing construction systems? And to define that, I think the engaged scholarship is the equalizing power relations, democratic practices, situation-based action, mutual learning, tools and techniques, and alternative visions about technology. So we've got this vision of automation as a design project that can be one that doesn't monopolize or centralize automation, as neoliberalism does, but demonstrates the capacity for automation to accelerate the production of distributed abundance and amplify interdependence instead of enabling further austerity, divisiveness, and marginalization. And it comes down to these three things. Vision for automation in architecture must confront the value systems and hierarchies embedded in both architecture, social and spatial practices, by radically rethinking architectural parts in terms of geometry, tectonics, and aesthetics. Redefine automation's capacity to enable increasing access to architectural production for the benefit of the many rather than the few. And also consider automation as transcalar and distributed. And yeah, so kind of moving more from the theory into the practice, just quickly giving some examples of stuff that we've done. Working across the UK to develop partnerships and projects with organisations actively working at the local or community scale. And yeah, in the projects, we're working towards a cooperative model where the communities that we work with also become stakeholders in the platform. We've, over the last couple of years, we've primarily worked with 2 communities in similar ways. So Knoll West in Bristol, down in southwest of the UK, and Hackney in East London. And in both of these, we're working with local residents and local policymakers, both groups that are quite disadvantaged by the status quo, in that there's a huge lack of trust from communities on the one hand, and then on the government side, an inability to really take any kind of risk. So yeah, while the work sometimes looks very localized if we zoom in, it's actually a large-scale project. And we believe that by embedding and distributing automation in these localized settings, we can design and deploy much larger coordinated networks that can operate using these systems, both sort of between the communities, but also between any other community, as long as the same ethics of care about that community remain at the core of the work. So in both locations of the project, we set up factories, not your typical factory setting. In Bristol, factory was a community arts organisation. And in Hackney, in London, it was a workshop for teaching young people how to lay bricks and other construction processes. So in the Bristol project, we used our own software application to co-design Block West, which is a community housing prototype built out of 145 of these discrete blocks and assembled together in less than 2 weeks. And as part of that, providing 25 part-time jobs in the local community. And really, on the one hand, it's a pavilion, but it's also a housing prototype where we could experiment with new ways of living and working. And also act as a training program for more permanent roles being created by our partners in the community in construction. And to give an idea of the kind of engagement, the group of 25s was 50% women and had people ages from 12 to 76. So yeah, in the Hackney project, it was really acting as a mechanism for Hackney Council to begin to understand how it could use smaller bits of land that they currently call nothing spaces. Essentially, they don't know what to do with, and engage the local communities to rethink housing production. And sort of demonstrated that by adapting the core structure to provide space for various things like sound installations, dance pieces, group meals, banquets, parties, filming, performances, basically a huge variety of uses. And it really demonstrates what could be achieved if we were thinking about participatory approach to housing, using digital tools, but also allowing the local council to have to test things out on land which is currently too risky for developers to take on. And then some more recent work, calling them Block Studios, which is primarily the work of the spin-out company, but it uses the same frameworks for labour and production that we've developed. So it's specifically related to the work of the lab. And these are the objectives here, was to reveal mutually beneficial knowledge sort of within the community, exploring local housing needs and automation opportunities, capture those local narratives from the community, and activate small micro backyard sites with workspaces and studios for that local community. And they, from a technical standpoint, they use a small enough number of the blocks to easily transport in a van, making them easy to move from their very local production place nearby. And yeah, really thinking about that production chain, rethinking what a factory may look like when it's actually embedded within a community. So just coming back to the sort of opening hard truths, all the work is trying to serve as a live laboratory for establishing forms of automation, which are like genuinely informed by and embedded within their communities. And yeah, asking these questions: can software be used by a community to disrupt conventional design power structures? It's only really by engaging with people that we can start to build and test this. For example, the combinatorial app that we developed for the project in Bristol. And what does a factory look like when it can be set up quickly within a very small footprint? Who's actually required to operate it? And how do the constraints of manufacturing methods inform the resulting architecture? How can construction methods be engineered in the climate emergency with sustainability and circularity as the main driver, and not just as an afterthought? So just to conclude, ultimately, what all this begins to do is unravel the notion of the expert and the professional, creating a more horizontal framework for wider participation in design automation, with the value that's created in the projects actually staying within the community itself. And it also enables us to think about how we can invest in social and technological infrastructure in communities to ensure that they have the skills and knowledge, resource to adapt, recognize and celebrate their interdependence, and grow resilience, not just in terms of material resilience, but also community resilience. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ivo. I think this question that you bring up about working directly with communities, like whether or not something is localized or whether something is universal, it seems to be a question that's like come up in many of the projects that we're sort of looking at today, like whether what is that difference, but between place are we thinking about research practices, especially ones that are looking at questions of data or automation? Are there tools or methodologies that we apply more broadly? So I guess maybe within that muddle of things that I just said, like thinking about like what is what is the universal or what is the local, and how do these tools make bridges or maybe even question those conditions?
Tough question. I think there are two sides. One, and I think it's important maybe to sort of differentiate between the physicality of the building system that we've developed and that we're using, which may be universal, or elements of it may be universal, but actually probably not. And then, sorry, the completely separate part is the frameworks by which we have carried out the projects. And maybe there are elements of the design software that allows co-design practices and engagement in the design and production process to actually take place. I think that's potentially more universal. And you can sort of imagine taking the framework and applying it to a different building system and achieving a different result, but through a similar process. And I think that's maybe where the universality of engaging with people, cultures are different, and we're obviously in different countries, different places, different communities, but we still work together, and we still need buildings, and sort of ultimately the framework is likely to be relatively common, I think.
And Masha, Jeff, Casey, like I don't know if that resonates with you as well, if someone wants to jump in.
Sure. Sorry, there's a bit of construction going on here. I apologize for that. But yeah, I think a question came up in the. Can you guys hear me okay, or is it okay? A question came up in the Q&A about, is this for multiple municipalities, and for, I think, relative to our project earlier, and right now, like, we're specifically working just on Los Angeles, and I think it kind of speaks to, and there's reasons for that, and one has to do with the kind of labor of production of the models. Like our students are being ultra specific just to get something that would correlate. I was actually only having them work on like zip code level networks in terms of building the data sets. And so when I say we're making a more robust data set, just generalizing from a single zip code to the city is already a big task. But the thing that's fascinating about these models is that is their ability to do very kind of granular and specific response to inputs. And if you have a robust enough data set that's able to accommodate enough kind of, like sets of billions of combinatorial features, you can respond in really intelligent ways to specific things more broadly. So it's this interesting kind of thing going between something which is maybe a universal tool or a general tool being applied to, but still being responsive to like local conditions. Like I think a good example in like natural language processing is something like GPT-3, which can speak very specifically based on what you tell it about a number of different like hyper-specific topics or even prose styles. But it's only able to do that because of the kind of vastness of the English language on which it was trained, right? So it becomes this an interesting counterpoint. And again, going back to kind of Ivo's point about kind of centralization for these automating tasks, right? Like the capital involved with building a data set that large is usually something that is held by the tech company or a large kind of centralizing force. So one of the kind of tasks is as we're working and trying to democratize using these tools a bit, even in a very limited way, is this issue about, on the one hand, they offer like this kind of universal application to very specific conditions without kind of broad stroking everything or being overly reductive. On the other hand, they require a massive investment of labor that seems to suggest centralization in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that we were talking about place, but it's also, I think, thinking about it through this idea of individuals versus data set, I think is also something that perhaps in Casey and Masha and the projects we're working on, that sort of how does one begin to make that bridge? There was a question in the Q&A about individuals with disabilities, and thinking through how do we address that kind of individual granular condition, but also sort of looking at it systemically. And I think Masha and Jeff, I think you both are sort of touching on that, especially I think through the natural language processing that Masha's involved in, like that difficulty of sort of bridging those two concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always, you're always oscillating between those two extremes, to be honest, right? Because what we found out right away when we selected all the vulnerable census tracts is they're statistically very similar. But once we get to the point of individual household and individual and single plot, the dynamics are very different. And so therefore the response, the policy response, right, or aid response has to be also individual, because very often our aids are directed in the same way, structured in the same way. But that is not the correct response, I think, if you start looking, if you have the access to this disaggregated data. But then obviously there is also like a point, like Jeff was talking, where you have to make some like types, right, that you have to address. So you have to find similarities within them. So I think it's a very fine balance within how you can address one household. You cannot address every single household, but how can you be as agile and as responsive to individuals? I think it's really interesting, I think, on a policy level, how to balance it.
Yeah, and Jeff, I really loved the graphic that you showed of the spatial representation around the 606 East and West. And it reminds me that when the research was starting to be done on the Los Angeles River, a mile-wide LiDAR was taken of the river. And I think that, that was anticipating the kind of speculative development towards either side of that waterway. But in thinking about it, this idea of mapping what is existing, and then sort of the role of the simulation or speculation or alternative vision, I think those are the different sort of terms that came up. How difficult is it to kind of get ahead of the on the ground conditions? Like to what degree can we make these speculations or simulations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I personally think it's tricky because I think the simulations or forecasting are all based on assumptions, and assumptions changed. Who thought, COVID-19 or the Great Recession, all sorts of things happen in the world. And so I think if you're transparent about those assumptions and the assumptions kind of built into your model, then it's interesting. It's an interesting exercise to go through. What we try to do is a little less maybe quote unquote technical, I guess, and we try to look at the pieces on the map, so to speak, and then connect the dots in a way that is intuitive or makes sense. But again, try to engage folks on the ground to try to really understand both what is really happening in certain neighborhoods. I mean, that's where we get a lot of our ideas, and we get people who call us and ask us questions about they're seeing something on the ground. They want to see if this can be somehow measured or quantified in data. And then we kind of poke around in the data to see if we can measure it. And then we kind of go back and forth. And through that process, we were able to put together a characterization of these different phenomenon and try to measure it in a certain way. But it really is that sort of on the ground story, those folks who have that experience and have that knowledge of their community that really makes that data kind of relevant. And so I try not to be, personally, our work is not to be too predictive, but I do think that we want to, give people a sense of what's happening and how to kind of connect the dots to be proactive in as data informed a way as possible.
And that idea of sort of proactive, or I think Casey was talking about, the idea of potentially lobbying or sort of communicating to a public seems important across all of these projects. And, I think all of us are within kind of more academic sort of bubbles for this work, but I was maybe wondering about thoughts about how to sort of make this communication more visible, or sort of how to kind of get it to a point where it is kind of engaging those who might need it the most.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in thinking about the audience is really always and how the information will be used is at least I think a really important part of the process for developing any outward facing or applied product, because community-based group might use information differently than a policymaker, than the media, than a foundation, than a financial institution. They're all making different kinds of decisions. They all have different types of experience with data, or so I think that product development might vary based on the audience, and it's an important part of the conceptualization process for the product in terms, is thinking about who the audience is and how they would use that information to make their decisions.
I think it's for the project we're working on, Mimi, I think it's a really interesting question because on the one hand, like we're trying to produce an app to communicate to like existing landowners that it's okay to add, housing on their property, right? But I guess the flip side of that is it also could be used as a tool for speculating on land, how to redevelop land by speculative developers or people that are going to kind of contribute further to the housing issues that we're dealing with. And so I think like how we design the site, and that's what I showed is not what the site's going to look like. We have a proper designer who's better at communicating to people than I am, who's going to be helping us develop this. But on the one hand, it's going to be a big part of it. On the other hand, I think there's also an assumption on our end that the kind of the high end, the kind of type of speculative developers that are driving kind of zombie urbanism already have these tools anyways, and they work better than ours. So in some ways, it's just trying to kind of level playing field with a more collective group of individuals being able to take advantage of the same types of tools that a big development company might.
I think for our project, it's mostly tenant union, LA Tenants Union. It's organizations like Stay House LA, with whom we've been talking before. So it's really more of an advocacy tool. We see that it can be used by individuals, but just for the reasons as Casey described in the moment, there is always a problem of misuse of the tool you build. So for now, I think we're really focusing more on working with the organizations that support tenants in their fight for staying housed.
I think we found the ability to have that physical manifestation of the things that we're talking about really powerful. It takes a lot of time to get there, I think, in terms of working towards that. But for example, it enables conversations in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So in the project in East London, for example, we had essentially a kind of community party where the neighbours of the site on the street came, people from the local school came, but also the local mayor of the borough came, and the sort of the council leaders in charge of housing also came, and everyone was doing the same thing, walking around the structure, poking it, fiddling about with it, and talking about the potentials, not necessarily of that particular manifestation, but the principles and the thinking behind it. So yeah, I think going forward, it is about the non-physical, whether it's software or kind of social process. But I think keeping the physical, the hardware ticking along as a companion is quite powerful for kind of moving things forward.
As kind of illustrated by the available city with the projects based in vacant lots across the south and west side of Chicago, I'm reminded of the Grow Greater Inglewood project with Atelier Bauhaus project on that site, but that it's calling attention to the Inglewood trail that wants to be developed, which would be, I guess, the equivalent of the 606 in some magical future. So that sort of balance between sort of the on the ground work with the more conceptual work seems to be kind of an interesting way to begin to communicate. We are at time. I'm gonna make us go over just a second more, because I think to this question of communication, Masha had brought up a question earlier when we were talking about representations and mapping, and I couldn't leave this conversation without talking a little bit about how mapping might sort of be perhaps manipulated or sort of suggest a kind of gamifying of the housing market. I think we're all addicted to Zillow, whether you're a layperson or whether you're someone who is sort of using it to mine the data sets. But Masha, I wanted you to talk maybe a little bit more about questions of mapping and representation, just so that we make sure that we cover that.
Yes, thank you, Mimi, for bringing this up. I think, yeah, there is a certain, as you say, danger, I think, in things that being so clearly laid out and very comparable to each other and easily navigatable, that on the one hand it lends to the user the feeling of things being very smooth and clear and simple. And then there's like a certain, I think, gamification, as we said, of housing as units to be evaluated, exchanged, moved around. There's like the simplification of the process turns it into a very liquid commodity, I think. And I think there's also this problem lends to the question to the projects that we are doing, right? Like, to what extent are we using the same methods of representation? And there are all obviously these collectives like Anti-Eviction Mapping Project who are intentionally trying to make maps slightly less legible with overlaying them with narratives that cover the legibility of the quantifiable data. But I think it's also right, like, if you're trying to make it useful, but at the same time to keep it away from a game. I think it's also something to keep in mind, and I think something like as educators to bring in the classroom as well.
Yeah, I think the kind of ease of some of these quote unquote ease, I should say, of some of these neural network tools sometimes make them. You can produce images without actually sort of analyzing what's actually going on in some of the images. I think Casey and I ran into that with some of our students where we were producing ADUs that fall in the street or in driveways, or, like that, that once you set the beast in motion, it everything is possible and doesn't always have a kind of proper logic to it at the stage that we're sort of bringing students in at. So, but I think this kind of the convincing model of the map is also something to sort of be careful about. What are we actually seeing? Let's see. We're a little 5 after. Is there anything else anyone wants to add to this conversation? This has been so wonderful to talk to you all. All right. Well, with that, I want to thank Casey, Masha, Ivo, Jeff, Marguerite, and everybody at the Chicago Architecture Biennial for partnering with SCI-Arc to do this conversation. And I hope this is just the beginning of kind of this fertile ground that I think we're all sort of wading into. And the way that we might be able to cross-pollinate and kind of develop together this really important issue. So, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're out.